Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Episode number 184. Today we're talking about MDN Web Docs. We are your hosts this week, Justin Bro, Leon Revel, Danny Blue, Eric Isaac. I was so close that time.
So
Isaac
close.
Sin.
It's only been how many years?
I know, so many years. It's because you're the last one. I should put you as the first one, and this would work better, and then I would not mispronounce names, which I am terrible at. Danny, Eric, how's it going?
It's going pretty good. Here on the East Coast, the snowstorm has finished, and the ice storm has just begun.
Well, at least you know your bourbon will be cold. You know, just the shade of correct ice. That's what it's all about.
I appreciate your sunny disposition.
Well, I'm in California where it's also cold, but I can wear a jacket and survive, so it'll be fine. So we're going to throw it over to kick off things before we introduce our guest this week. We're going to throw it over to Leon, who's going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon.
Thank you, Justin. So first of all, there's a new release of Next.js, that's version 8. Some of the headline features for this release are massive build time memory usage reduction, smaller initial HTML size, faster static exports, and so much more. So check out the link to find out all of the details. There's a new version of Stencil.js out also, that's version 0.18, and this includes an update to TypeScript 3.3.3. There's bug fixes and also loads of other nice things in that release. There's a major version of Mocha.js, which is version 6. This has got some huge improvements and loads of bug fixes and deprecations, etc. So check out the link to find out all the details for that release. There's also a new release of VisBug. This has got some awesome features in it, like the ability to measure distance. There's also Shadow DOM support and loads of other things. So again, check out the link to find out all of the cool new things in VisBug. There's been an intent to ship published for Blink, which is for the private class field spec. That's quite cool. And finally, there's a new release of WebDriver. That's version 5.5. And this has also got support for Shadow DOM now, which is really cool to see. So check out the link to find out all of the details about the new WebDriver release. So that's everything from me for This Week in Web. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Leon. Interesting things happening on the platform this week. I always like to see that, we're in February, so we're really getting into the groove of we should ship things. So that's always a plus. And speaking of shipping things and whatnot, today we're talking about documentation. We're talking about web docs. We're talking about MDN.
Everybody's favorite topic, documentation.
I think it's our favorite topic of things. I particularly think documentation is super important for developers who are often lost in a sea of, can I actually use that API? Which can be difficult. And we've got 3 guests this week. It's a magical blessing of guests. Ali, Kadir, and Robert, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Hi, Justin.
Thank you.
So for those out there who don't know who each of you are, why don't you each introduce yourself? Ali, can you start?
Sure. I'm Ali Spivak. I work at Mozilla. The easiest way to describe what I do is I oversee a big chunk of our developer relations, including MDN. I've been in charge of MDN or overseeing MDN for about 7 years now.
And Kadir, how about yourself?
Hey, I'm Kadir. I started as a web developer in, I think, 98 and started at Mozilla in 2010. I've been the product manager for MDN now since 2006, I think. Yeah.
Robert?
Hi, I'm Robert Nyman. I used to work with these lovely people from Mozilla. I still work with them, but just different people are paying me for it. So I work at Google with web developer relations across many, many different things. And I'm happy and blessed to be able to have some good touch points with Mozilla and MDN.
And we're going to talk a little bit today about the Product Advisory Board, amongst other things. But before we get into that sort of segment of things, which I think is massively interested in, what is really MDN today? because a lot of times we talk about documentation on the show in respect to the libraries and frameworks that folks use. I know that we often, commend people for trying to write good documentation, but where does MDN fit into that conversation today? Because the documentation for the platform itself has never been particularly simple within a single source.
Well, I can start with a history of MDN, and then
that would be good.
Kadir can kind of shift into what's going on really today. So MDN actually is about 12 years old, surprisingly enough, and actually started out as documentation mostly for Firefox, very specifically for like the Firefox internals, so Gecko and sort of the browser engine. And then because the browser obviously is really important in things like APIs, we started documenting web standards as part of that documentation. And over time, we realized that it made more and more people were more interested in the web standards, or it was a broader audience, I guess. And so we separated out the Firefox stuff into, all the Firefox internals and contributing to Firefox and how it works into its own section, and really over the last, I would say 5 or 6 years, really focused on documenting the standards, the web standards, and that's been hugely popular. And we've really seen a ton of growth there. And so that's really been where we chose to focus a lot of our effort. And it aligns really closely with Mozilla's mission of promoting the web broadly and web standards specifically.
So I have a very quick general question, kind of as a comparison point. We just talked to Rob Dodson not that long ago about web.dev, which seems like it has a slightly different, its goal, it seems different from something like MDN. Can you talk about, I guess, kind of how MDN is different from other resources that might be out there? Or is that too broad of a question for?
Maybe I can take. All right. So, developers really want, when it comes to documentation, they want completeness and correctness of information. And pretty much regardless of who is offering that, those are the two things that developers generally want from documentation. And MDN has really been leading in these categories for the last couple of years. And I think that's also where its strength lies. Not necessarily going after the latest trends, but really those fundamentals are very strong in MDN. And I think we're going to talk about that a little later, the Product Advisory Board members joining in and helping out, that foundation is getting just stronger and stronger. And I think that's what sets MDN apart from a lot of other sources, which are also great, but that property of being complete, like being able to find all web standards actually documented in one place. That's what MDN actually delivers.
Awesome. Thank you.
It is hard to sort of grasp the overall sort of wealth of spec that we have in terms of the platform and yet somehow make it readable. Because I enjoy reading the spec as much as the next person, but a lot of times what is the spec is not necessarily what is the API that we currently see within the scope of what's available on the web today. Do you all find it troublesome to sort of make those sort of condensing something down that is quite broad in terms of the way specs are written into something that is somewhat developer or / human readable in a lot of cases?
I'm going to do a quick plug here for the writing team. So at Mozilla, we have a team of writers. It's pretty small. It's like 5 full-time folks and some folks who do some contract, and then a huge amount of volunteer contributors. And I don't think they get enough sort of accolades on how brilliant they really are, because it is so, like you mentioned, it's so hard to take specs and really condense them down. So, one of our writers who sort of owns our JavaScript topic area works really closely with all the folks working on the standards and ECMA and various things to really make sure that they're understanding the standard and driving, really making sure that they're understandable and interpreted correctly. And there's a lot of back and forth that goes on across the industry with different folks to really make sure what we're doing. But I feel like they're, I said they're my team, so I'm maybe biased, but I don't think I'm that biased. That they're really do some really phenomenal work. Like I read the standards and I read the MDN documentation. I'm like, how did you interpret that in a way that makes it so understandable? Because a lot of times the specs is like, wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, if anybody is curious about just how big of a difference is, try look up something like anything like array, like an array operator or something like that. Look up this documentation, be like, oh, I understand that really well, and then go look up the actual spec that's supposed to be used by implementers. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I think it's a different audience. The specs are incredibly complete and everything else. It's not meant to be a judgment on them, but they're designed very specifically for implementers, and being able to translate that into something that developers can actually use, I think is almost an art.
You just mentioned the vastness of the space, and it's true. Like on MDN, we're currently documenting about 10,000 web platform features. And if you go into the specs, they're even bigger than that. But yeah, I think it can sometimes really hard to wrap your head around the surface area of that platform that we are all developing on.
I was just going to say, I think tech writers are some of the most underappreciated people in tech. They do amazing things and they can bring clarity to so many areas. So I'm just immensely grateful that we have them. And the people that I at least get in touch with at Mozilla and who work on MDN can make, and again, like Ali said, I'm not saying that specs are boring, but the tech writers at MDN can make any topic interesting.
One of the challenges I have, with training younger developers who come on board, is they want to get stuff done real fast. We obviously all have to ship, as Justin keeps reminding us, and they just want to know, they just want to know, how do I fix this one thing, right? How do I just want to fix this. I don't want to have to go through all this. So it can be really challenging, even in an application that you're trying to document for your own team. That stuff gets stale very quickly, but the JavaScript ecosystem, especially CSS to a degree, just fly by and gets really difficult to keep up. How do you kind of balance a lot of that with newcomers to the platform?
I think
easy question,
so. We have.
I know.
Sorry. We're trying to avoid talking over each other. I think more than anything, it's like a pause. I'll let someone else talk.
So we actually have recently started looking at that a little bit closer. And one thing we're doing now is it's MDN. A lot of people know MDN as a reference, and that's certainly the core of MDN. Just documenting those 10,000 web platform features, that's a lot of work, and we're trying to stay on top of that and make sure that we deliver this complete and correct documentation for that. But as you said, it can be really daunting to actually just jump into that. So a while ago, Chris Mills, the content lead on the MDN team, he brought in the idea of actually a learning area. So to essentially provide an on-ramp for developers to be able to actually use the reference that we are providing on the other side. So that's what we've been looking into recently, and the growth in that area is just phenomenal. Because I think there is definitely a demand for being able to get the fundamentals, so you can actually start using some of the more advanced parts of it. Something that we haven't on MDN that we haven't been focused on so much. You mentioned the shift in frameworks, and things can move very quickly in that area. So on MDN, we've been very much focused on just the fundamentals so far. But it is an area that we are looking into for the future to really give people who are starting on the web today a better understanding of what the landscape looks like.
Yeah, and we're also looking kind of out into the future into more educational content, and this is something we're really digging into right now, and hopefully sort of the second half of the year we'll start doing some things in that area. And also thinking, one of the things that I know Kadir hears, I'm assuming other people, is that there's a lot, there's content for like beginner, and there's content for people who are advanced, like know their stuff. But there's a real gap between that. Okay, I know HTML, I've learned JavaScript, but like, how do I effectively sort of translate that into everyday work? And so we're also thinking a bit about like, how do you bridge that? Like, it's great when people tell you like best practice, go do this thing, but how can we help people sort of take that step in a way that is really work focused versus kind of a theoretical set of best practices? So that's another thing we're really thinking about long term. How can we help people there?
That's great. Thank you.
So there is this sort of wide sort of spanning need, right? You have developers who need certain types of documentation. You have advanced developers who need other types of documentation. You have browser implementers. There is a lot within the pool of things, and that must be incredibly difficult from a priority standpoint, but also from a many vendors out there standpoint. Obviously, Microsoft had MSDN for a long time, which has now started to redirect into MDN. Google had started a couple years ago now saying, hey, we're going to start clearinghousing information to MDN. How is that sort of beyond the just problems of supporting all of these different things, how has it sort of helped develop out MDN itself? Because there is a lot of times you think, oh, well, it's just a page with text on it and things, but there are code samples, there are interactive samples. How do you sort of manage that? How do you divide all that things up with only small sets of teams doing on the writing side as well as the technology side?
We're really trying to focus on developers. You mentioned there are lots of different target audiences there, implementers on one hand, or browser vendors, but it's developers and designers, the information they need to build things on the open web. And it's pretty much like that's the guiding principle. That's also what sets us apart from like the specs themselves. But then beyond that, when we actually look into how are we going to move from where we are, like how do we serve people better? We actually did take a step back recently and looked at that. And it turns out that people on MDN are really happy with MDN itself. Like people coming to MDN were really happy. So that's when we realized we actually had to branch out to people who were currently not on MDN. And that's when we started doing some more user research into this and really understanding more the different kinds of developers that are out there. And that's where you mentioned like interactive examples. That's where that actually came from. That's where that came from. It's this understanding that there are people who are concept-oriented, like top-down, who want to just understand something first, conceptual, before they dig into it. And then there are people who want to play around with things. They want to essentially like come up with an example, change it, and then build their mental models from there, like bottom up. So action-oriented and concept-oriented developers. And we were really addressing concept-oriented developers on MDN. They were really happy with what we were giving them. But we realized we also had to essentially reach out to those action-oriented developers. And that's where those interactive examples essentially came from, to give them something on MDN that would actually help them understand things better. And that's actually what a lot of this comes down to, is talking to users, understanding their needs through user research that we now do on a regular basis, and essentially talking to users.
So do you find that, you say talking to users, and, a lot of times documentation has a tendency to be written for, not necessarily for users, which I think is often somewhat funny, particularly in a lot of systems you see inside of certain corporations where you're going, I don't know who that documentation was ever written for, but I'm sure someone checked off something on a Jira board. The reality is that beyond that developer sort of centric nature of things, I mean, where is that sort of unhappiness, though? Because we can kind of joke about where are the unhappy people, which I know Robert just made a joke of in the side channel chat, which I think was really funny. That from a developer standpoint, where is that gap from those user surveys? Where do people find that that documentation has a tendency to be missing? Is it the new side of APIs that just are sort of starting to sort of land or in an experimental phase? Is it people who feel like they've been sliced out of that conversation? So either developers who are new to the platform or designers who don't necessarily know how to design for the platform. Are there really specific trends that you're starting to see within those user groups?
So it's when you talk about the content of the documentation itself, people just can't get enough of examples. And with 10,000 web platform features, we're very far away from actually covering all of them with that new approach. So I think we still have a long way to go to bring that interactivity of those examples to all of the content out there. I think that's a key aspect of it. And then beyond that, it often goes into this area of completeness and correctness, like browser compatibility data. I mean, obviously, keeping up to date on that is a challenge, especially with the diversity of browsers that we have on desktop and mobile. So that's something that people do tell us about, and it's across the board. Because if you look at our audience, you'll see that only half of MDN users, and we say users, but obviously these are developers, but half of the people coming to MDN, they don't consider themselves web developers. So not front end, not back end, not full stack. But across the board, a lot of them have to work with different kinds of browsers. So browser compatibility is a big thing. And having up-to-date information for people when it comes to that's key. And that's something that we're also focusing on MDN right now.
That's actually one of the things I really like is I can go on there and you have a mobile section and a desktop section that tells exactly what version, what browser. And you can get that in some other sites, but it's pretty full-fledged. Even in a lot of cases, there's full polyfills that you can copy paste. There's examples of usage, and I find JavaScript is where a lot of the cases are handled really well on MDN. CSS probably a little bit less, but one of the things that I found when going through with developers is SVG and how that works, examples with that, and those sort of things that developers encounter all the time is not as well documented. And correct me if I'm wrong, please.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, those are some of the niches that you just mentioned there, like SVG in particular. It's a small share of MDN's content and MDN's traffic, but we have recently actually started the refactoring of that area.
It would be fantastic because I have looked for a really good reference for those sort of things.
Yeah, one of the things that we prioritized this year, kind of for the Mozilla team, is really what we call maintenance, but really is kind of refactoring the docs. So going back and looking at the things that we've had up for a while and making sure that we're giving them the love and attention that they need and deserve, so that we're not 100% focused on new all the time. And really, and like Kadir mentioned, SVG is one of those areas that it's like, oh, it's been a long time. We should really put some effort into those as well.
It's not just MDN though. There's no place that I can see. I mean, I bought Chris Coyer's book, and that helped quite a bit. But it doesn't go into details as far as what support is what, and like how the attributes work versus the CSS with that, because CSS is very different with those sort of things. But that's great to hear that you guys are looking into it. Thank you.
I can give the full Mozilla answer, and it's a wiki. Like if you're missing it, you can add it, right?
Well, that brings up a curious point too. You talk about the nature of contribution to sort of MDN, and obviously Mozilla has writers that do it. Obviously, other browser vendors, Chrome and Edge and whatnot, are starting to use it as a clearinghouse. But there is a lot of community contribution ongoing on the platform.
Yeah, absolutely. The contribution sort of tends to fall into a couple areas. So most of the actual articles themselves are written by folks at browser vendors. So whether that's Mozilla, Google, Microsoft, various other folks, a lot of our contribution is more edits, like specific edits, updates, that type of thing. We've had quite a few people contributing code samples, for example, like the interactive samples. A huge amount of our volunteer contribution or open source contribution is around localization. So we have a lot of really active communities. The French community, for example, has been really, really active maintaining the French translation or French localization of MDN. And that's really where we see kind of a sustained effort from external folks. We get much, or from sort of outside volunteer folks. Most of the core articles themselves it's a lot of work to sort of, you said, translate the standards and sort of figure out how to represent them in a way that's useful. So that actually is done less by contributors and much more sort of by the sort of core folks at the browser vendors. And then there's we get thousands of people contributing either localization or fixing typos and code samples and various other things like that.
What is the review process for something like that? Because I would imagine, since MDN I kind of see as the gold standard right now, right, for this, like, so how would you do that?
It's actually really funny that you say that. Robert just mentioned that MDN is a wiki, which is absolutely correct. And in true wiki fashion, the review comes after the edit. And I think that served us really well to get here with MDN, like getting MDN from 0 to where it is. But we've also been thinking about the future of MDN, and it's that's more of the pull request model. So when you're contributing browser compatibility data to MDN these days, or interactive examples, you can already see that it's on GitHub. So you send us a pull request and we review it right there, right then. But MDN content itself currently is on a wiki, so anybody can just go in and edit it, and that can be daunting. So we are hoping that with the move to this pull request model, it will make it a little easier, lower the barrier a little for people to actually make a change and let us know about that.
Talk about shaping the standards.
Yeah, we do monitor. We do monitor edits. It's not a free for all, but there's not a huge barrier to entry to sort of start editing anyway.
That's great though.
So speaking of sort of hacking on MDN and doing those sorts of things, you all have run specific sort of workshops or events in the past. I know there's one coming up in April at Perf Matters Conf, where you can hang out with folks and hack on specific articles on MDN. Are you looking to run sort of more of those events to get even more community involvement as sort of this new model of sort of pull requests, and also just to keep that wiki sort of content rolling today?
Yeah, the actual event's called Hack on MDN. We started them back in 2014. And at first they were kind of originally they were doc sprints. So we would get kind of our core doc contributors to come together once or twice a year and spend a weekend hacking on docs and working on docs together. And then it morphed into kind of a broader Hack on MDN where we would also work on the underlying wiki platform, which is called Kuma. And so we've been doing those for several years. We were doing one per year, and then we've recently shifted and started doing 2, and I think we may have more than 2 this year, and really focusing on themes. So last year we had an accessibility themed Hack on MDN in London, where we got folks from the accessibility community together and focused on writing accessibility content on MDN and also doing some updates to MDN itself to make it more accessible. And that Perf Matters were, again, focusing pretty obviously on performance. So writing some guides to improving performance on your websites and also improving MDN's overall performance as well. And I believe we're doing another Hack on MDN in Austin later this year. And we're looking at some other events as well, where you just get groups of folks who want to make MDN better together and do work associated around that theme.
I think a lot of the accessibility stuff that you have on there is better than WebAIM. There's a lot of really good stuff there.
And the Hack on MDN that Ali just mentioned in Austin is going to be specifically about accessibility. So hopefully it's going to get even better.
So we've talked a lot about sort of content on MDN, sort of what developers are getting out of it. I kind of want to shift gears a little bit and talk about sort of the future that is MDN and a little bit about the Product Advisory Board, because like we've mentioned at various points in this in today's show, that Mozilla is running the infrastructure. They're doing, you all are doing the bulk of that work, but there's a lot of contributions now coming from the outside, from other browser vendors. And the Product Advisory Board was sort of chartered. How did that come about? Why an advisory board now?
So it kind of grew from a bunch of different conversations that were happening. Kadir and I had been discussing sort of broadly, how can we get more folks in the industry and other browser vendors sort of more involved in MDN and get their input on, platform features or things that we were doing, and just really, as we're trying to say, like, we really want to make sure that we're covering the web standards that developers are using. Kind of going back to our early history of MDN with a Firefox base. For a long time, we based a lot of what we chose to document on what was coming out in Firefox. And we wanted to take a broader view of what's going on in the world, about what's important to developers, regardless of what browser they were using. So that was some of the genesis. And we started having conversations also with Microsoft about doing some redirects of their documentation. And that sort of synthesized into this idea of having a product advisory board where we could get both the other browser vendors and also independent folks in the industry to sort of give us, obviously advice around what content, what they were hearing from developers in their sphere, what was coming out on the various different browsers. And that was kind of the initial thought of what we would do, why the product advisory board would be interesting. And since Robert was a former Mozilla person, we kind of poked him and say, hey, what do you think about this idea? Had some similar conversations with folks we knew at Microsoft, and it grew from that, and now includes Google, Microsoft, the W3C, Samsung, Buku. So that, the original idea was, hey, well, give us advice about our product roadmap or our content roadmap, and we can adjust it to make sure that we're covering it broadly. It's morphed a bit in the little over a year and a half, I guess now, or about a year and a half that it's been around, where it's also proved to be a really good conduit into the various organizations and sort of helping us essentially extend our network. So the Browser Compatibility Project, which Kadir can go into great detail on, we've been able to work really closely with Microsoft and Google and have conversations, and everyone, but have conversations really about like the tools that they're using to manage compatibility and work directly with their teams. So it's really kind of helped make MDN this sort of cross-industry resource and tied everybody more tightly together, which was, I think a unintended side effect that's had great outcomes for MDN. Like it helps us really think more broadly about the things that we can do, and sort of what else is going on outside of the company and where that outside of Mozilla, and how that could impact developers.
I'm so happy you said synthesized in the beginning. I thought you were going for synergies, and then the podcast would be over and it would be awkward.
We do have a hard stop on the word synergy.
It was definitely a win-win situation. I have to say that.
If we're going to play buzzword bingo, I was in marketing for a while. I can probably win that. Or lose it, depending on how you want to.
Okay, so let's take a step back here. And so I think from my side as well, where it's really interesting, like when Ali brought up the idea way back, like 2 years ago, maybe, first time. And I think, at least from my side, the idea was really quick. It's like, oh, yeah, this would be great. And then, of course, working for big corporations, the rest of the time goes into legal and approvals, and then actually kicking it off. But I think it's been, at least from my side and from Google's side, it's been really good. Like we have one tech writer, Joe Medley, who more or less works full-time on helping out with MDN as well and contributing. And I do think a lot of the people representing on the board are working within developer relations in one way or the other. And if you work in developer relations, like it's like your natural instinct is try to see ways of connecting people to solve issues, to get more things done. So I think everyone on the board is sort of driven by, as soon as something comes up, it's like, but you should talk to, this person and that person, and we can do this, etc. And I think there's been so far some really interesting outcomes of just introducing more people in certain aspects of the work. And I think last time around when we met in person about a month ago in New York, we were able to bring a couple of guests for parts of the session as well, and just figure out like, how can we do this better, and how can we get the orgs closer to each other? And personally, not being a Mozilla employee, but like from the outside, I've been really happy from my side of everyone on the board is so extremely humble and aiming for the big picture, and then making the future better for MDN. So I'm both really grateful and really inspired that we have the board to begin with.
Well, I know everyone here has probably read all of the meeting notes. I know I've read them cover to cover.
Before I go to bed every night.
There you go. See, and I want to kind of touch on that point too, Robert, because when you talk about the collaboration that's ongoing in there, it comes out in the meeting notes, which are all public. They're all on GitHub. They're easy to assess to see sort of where things are headed and the conversations that are happening. And there seems to be a lot of very exciting things sort of ongoing that are sort of coming out of that charter, as well as sort of the roadmap of planning there. Which gives me great hope, because in the past, one might say, a decade or so ago, that was not necessarily the case when it came to the web. It was a dark time. Sometimes we talk about it and I play scary music on the background of the show. But alas, there seems to be quite a bit of collaboration ongoing, both on the data side. Obviously, Chrome folks have the UX report side of life that gives a lot of interesting data as to sort of the APIs and sort of things that are out there in the wild on the web. Obviously, there's a lot of these sources that are starting to come together, it appears, to sort of make not only developers' lives better on MDN, but also MDN as a whole more full-featured in that regard. Do you find those meetings? I mean, I can only imagine from reading the notes that it's really an embarrassment of riches in terms of things to do. How are you going through those meetings? How are you sort of deciding these are, who has sort of the final say? This is what we're going to do.
Broadly was Mozilla. I mean, the MDN team in the end really sort of picks the direction, on the product side and the content side. There's a lot of conversation and back and forth. And when you said embarrassment of riches, we actually at the last meeting decided, like, we talk about all these things and we have so many ideas or things that we could follow up on that we like, we should probably prioritize and sort of shrink that list down to, these are the specific things we're going to accomplish, attempt to accomplish by the next advisory board meeting, so that it's not just this giant laundry list. But that advisory board is really advisory. I don't, although it's so collaborative that it doesn't really feel like it. It's not a hard thing. It's just an advisory board. Because it is incredibly collaborative and folks work so well together that but yeah.
It definitely sets it apart, to be certain, wouldn't you say? Because I've seen other advisory boards fail for that reason, where it is surely an advisory board where people are just spewing forth ideas that benefit them and only them, right? As opposed to, hey, we're this community of people who work in this particular field and we want to we want to lift everybody up. There is a big difference in that, I would say, based on what I read in the notes.
Yeah, that is the really phenomenal, I have to say, the working on, having the board is just delightful for that reason.
I think this is, I think, fundamental about the web, and something that you don't really have anywhere else. It's not really owned by any entity. MDN might be documenting the web, but we don't decide on the direction of the web. So I think that's where that collaboration also comes from an understanding among web browser vendors that the competition is not in what features we offer on the platform itself. That's actually more of a collaborative thing that we want to do. And you see that in the browser compat data as well. It's like, if it's not broadly available to users, developers don't care about it. So I think that's where that collaborative spirit comes from. And it's really great to work with that. I can say, you asked about preparation, like how do you go into this? How do you prepare for this? For me, it's pretty much the same I prepare for our quarterly business reviews. It's the same level of involvement, the same level of detail that we want to present there and talk to the people in the advisory board about.
Well, and the numbers have come up a lot, I would say, based on the last meeting notes I read. I mean, the amount of traffic MDN gets now is continuing to rise, as I think is a testament to the documentation getting better.
It's just amazing. I think we've grown about 100% in a little over 2 years. Like we've doubled our traffic, which is just about phenomenal.
Yeah, there's still 5 to 7 developers that you need to reach, and then you're done.
Right.
I mean, I think it also shows that most of the time, if I'm Googling a spec or something now, the first piece that comes up is the MDN documentation, which I think also shows, one, that, the fact that more people are coming, but also that they are coming because it's good, because it is accurate.
Yeah, I mean, we've been looking at the same data, and it's absolutely true. The team has done a phenomenal job on specifically also making sure that we don't just have the right content, but it's presented in the right way. I mean, search engine optimization is sometimes a dirty word, but in this case, it's really presenting the data in a way that's useful to users, and that gets recognized, I think.
So speaking of those 5 to 7 users we have not reached yet with the documentation, I do want to talk a little bit about the notion of localization and sort of the overseas outreach, because there's a lot of developers coming on board in sort of the developing countries out there where connections are not necessarily greatest. I know, Robert, you and I have talked about sort of your experience in Southeast Asia and whatnot, and I do quite a bit of work out there myself, and there's a lot of young developers who are just coming onto the platform who haven't seen these sort of things. How does localization sort of fit into this? Like, it must be very difficult given the nature of just as much, I mean, how much content is there, how to translate that, and localization never is particularly easy. I mean, is that a focus as you look to sort of grow MDN more across these boundaries as more data comes in to say, oh, we need to, look at country XYZ and, this language set?
So Mozilla broadly relies on community translation / localization. So we have an incredibly strong, like Mozilla as a company and has a really strong tradition of local communities doing the localization. And that's really our strategy going forward, as opposed to sort of paying to localize. I think what I'm also interested in is what are the needs of those emerging communities versus focusing on language. And I will pause here and say, I don't think saying, oh, English is the default language, so that's all fine, because I don't actually believe that at all. But I do think that different types of documentation, we mentioned some people really want the interactive samples because that's how they learn. Looking at what those communities need as far as being able to access the documentation, and then figuring out how we can grow those communities of localizers where they're needed. We've seen a huge jump in the number of users from China in the last couple of years. I'm like, well, we haven't, there hasn't been a huge amount of localization into any of the Chinese languages. So why is that? And we're sort of digging in to figure out where that's coming from. But I'm much more interested in making connections into the Chinese communities and finding folks who are passionate about doing that localization than sort of we're going to pick 2 languages and spend a bunch and invest in those. I think it's really how can we encourage folks who care about the documentation and give them all the tools they need to do the localization or learn the way that they want to learn.
I think that's a really good point. And from the Google side, we had both community contributions, but also professional translations. And at least from what I know, when you get professional translations, they're really good at languages, but they don't know the terms or the technology. So I speak with a lot of developers who are non-native English speakers and from different parts of the world. and when they read the documentation in their language, not on MDN, but like in some Google places and other sites, for them, they would rather go for the English one, even though it's harder for them, because it makes more sense. Whereas the translation to their own language just becomes, half useful, half really awkward and weird, and doesn't make any sense at all, because every technical term has been translated. So I do think translations, it is really hard, but it needs to be driven by that passion, that interest in the topic itself, and not just, I know 2 languages.
And languages are certainly a part of it, but that's not all. Like when you go to India, for example, it is very much English focused, but it's still a different audience. Generally, when you look at the US, we get 5% of our traffic from mobile in the US. It's like the vast majority is on desktop computers. Understandably, they use MDN when they're coding. But in India, 20% of our users are on mobile devices. And that really threw us off in the beginning, because we were looking at performance, and performance in India was so much worse than in the US. We thought it was maybe the network, but it turns out it's actually because they're on mobile devices that are generally much slower than desktop devices. So that's been something that we've been focusing on last year on performance. And we've worked with Tim Cadlick and the average MDN page is now half the size it was before we started that work. So I think there is definitely something to be said about the language, but there are also other factors that are important when it comes to addressing people in different geographies.
Yeah, that's definitely going to help too with the mobile rankings, since it's mobile index only on Google, from what I understand now. So
apparently it's more. Yeah, definitely. That didn't hurt that it helped with that either.
It is a very wide sort of scope of things. Like you said, language is not sort of the delineating factor in a lot of cases, but even examples, right? If you've seen sort of the structure of the way folks develop stuff in other countries, like it isn't necessarily the same way we would necessarily approach it, but because of a certain piece of documentation and an example they saw that, resonated within that, given subset of a community, it's I don't know if it's a solvable problem. We'll have it solved tomorrow. Danny's got a week off upcoming, so he's just going to work on that and solve it for you all. It'll be fine. Danny's got lots of time.
Yeah, I'm not worried about it. If I'm not worried, I don't know why you all would be worried.
So, we've talked a lot about, where it's going and what's there. I mean, what do you think is missing? Like, what are we missing today within all the surveys and the data of developers and sort of how browser use is going? Obviously, Al, you talked about China, like, is bringing something like UC onto the board like a possibility, which, is a very heavily used browser in that area. Is, what's sort of the gap that you wish maybe in 2019 might get filled?
I have a couple things. So one, I think we sort of touched on that sort of figuring out more education. And also, like, if we're talking about localization, like things like tutorials and guides, like the context setting, I think those are really areas that it's important. Like, if I was thinking of where I'd want to focus translation and localization, it's really around those, because I think the reference docs themselves are, code focused, but the context, I think, is the areas where it makes sense to try and help people understand them in different settings. Thinking more broadly about education, I am very personally want us to start looking more into China. Just we've seen a lot of growth there, and some of that, doing some outreach to the UC browser. The Google folks have actually helped us there. Would be really important, but also just better understanding of the needs of developers in China broadly, and also just I think we're focusing a bit on how can we customize MDN or make it do some fun stuff there that hopefully people will like. We have a list of things people ask us for, and it's like offline MDN and dark theme. So those are things we're gonna look at moving forward. I'm kind of excited about.
I think there are two things, not only about MDN, but generally for like web developers, that I not worry about, but I looking into the future, like one is, and well, MDN as well in this case, like with frameworks, where they sort of fit in, like way back, I don't know, like 10 years, 8 years, whatever, it was generally like, a few smaller frameworks, and then it was either all in on jQuery, or there was like the anti-jQuery movement kind of ish, which was at least fairly simple to deal with. But now we have so many good and prominent frameworks who do solve and abstract a lot of issues for developers. But then, as mentioned early in this talk, is what do we do with MDN, and what you document and what don't you document? And it's also like picking the most popular frameworks, and what happens if they go away and then you have redundant information, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one tricky part. The other tricky part, my general opinion, is that it seems to be going in the wrong direction. Like, sure, you can build amazing things on the web, but it also seems to be harder and harder to be a front-end developer on the web. There's so many things you need to learn, and there's even more options you have now. So are there ways that we can try and distill that with being too opinionated? Are there ways we can help developers? Are there ways we can actually improve the web platform as well? Which I think leads to one thing that was in the last meeting notes from the advisory board, is there is a developer needs survey that's going to take place on MDN. And it's going to be really interesting to get as much answers on that as possible, with what's missing on the web or what's too hard on the web, and how can the specifications and the platform vendors make that better for developers. So I think, to me at least, they are the big challenges, and we'll make them better, but they're big.
Those are definitely big challenges. And when you also look at what's next on MDN itself, we are looking at MDN has been one size fits all for a long time. And as you mentioned, there are different kinds of developers. Not everybody has the same kinds of needs. And we just talk about browser compatibility. Some people need to support IE9 at their job, and then others have a side project where they're happy to just support the latest 2 versions of any given browser. And so far, it's always been the same thing when you go to MDN. And we want to actually look into needs of developers and see where we can adjust MDN to really be more personal and to fit their use cases better. So that's something that we're currently researching on MDN, and something that we're hoping to focus on in terms of development later this year.
So we're running up against the edge of time, and I'm curious, what have we not asked? What is the thing that we totally forgot to ask about MDN or Web Docs or generally the web and things? What have we missed?
I felt pretty comprehensive. Yeah, that was a pretty wide-ranging conversation. I got in my pitch on why the writers are so awesome. So I'm feeling pretty good.
Well, there's a first time for everything on the show. That's comprehensive. I like that.
I have never once been described as comprehensive.
Oh, Danny, you sell yourself short. I've seen your code. It's beautiful. In comparison to mine is just junk all the time. Well, with that then, thank you all so much for coming on the show today. We greatly appreciate it. And we'll make sure when the user needs survey comes out, we'll make sure to promote that as well. We want to get that out to as many developers as we can. We all love MDN very, very much, which is why we're so happy to have you on the show. So thank you all so much.
And thank you. It was really a pleasure here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Danny, Eric, closing thoughts before we wrap up episode number 184 of the Web Platform Podcast?
It's still icing outside.
Stay out of the ice, Danny. Stay out of the ice.
I really appreciate everybody coming. I just wanted to say, you guys are doing a great job. Keep it up.
Oh, also that.
Thank you, guys. This was really great.
Well, this has been episode number 184 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today, we've had Ali, Kadir, and Robert on to talk about MDN Web Docs and all things web and platform related. Tune in next week when we talk more things web, more things platform. more things that make your web development experience just a little bit better. Have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.